everybody, welcome back to the show, Science Dispatch Podcast, episode 35. My name is Cameron English. I'm your host as always, joined again by Dr. Chuck Dinerstein, Director of Medicine at the American Council on Science and Health. Chuck, what's going on?
It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. I don't know if you've been following the weather, but we had some horrifically cold weather the other day, and where I live, the wind blows, and it was brutal. And now it's 50 degrees, so God only knows what's going on with the winter here in the Northeast.
Are you going to be one of those older gentlemen that moves down to Florida for the sake of your bones?
No.
No?
No. I will occasionally visit some other people that have already snowbirded themselves down there, but I just don't see living in Florida.
Not your scene. No. Fair enough. Well, let's jump into the stories we're going to talk about today. First one is how scientific is, quote, peer-reviewed science? And then we're going to do another story, this one by our colleague, Dr. Bloom, who sadly wasn't able to join us. This is called People Worry Hysterically About Low-Risk Carcinogens, and Then They Drink, which, of course, as we'll get into, alcohol is very much a carcinogen. But first up, Chuck, let's talk about this peer review article. This is by our colleague, Dr. Henry Miller. And he's talking here about what may surprise a lot of people, which is that the peer review process is a little sketchier and in some cases even corrupt. And I don't think a lot of people know that. So what was your take on this?
I had the same feeling, except I've known it for some time. There are a lot of very misaligned incentives in the world of science publications. The old phrase used to be publish or perish. And that's where the misalignment begins. In order to work your way towards a tenured position at a university, you need to publish a body of research. And over time, they've gotten to be a little bit more sophisticated about what constitutes an acceptable journal for that. But the concept that if you don't publish, then you will not get tenure and you will find yourself as the adjunct faculty still pertains. So there's a big incentive on the part of junior faculty to write papers and to get papers accepted. There are other ways in addition to burnish your resume and your CV. So when the tenure and promotion committee looks at it, it looks favorably upon you. And that is being a peer reviewer for a journal. So a lot of junior faculty sign up to do peer review of articles in addition to trying to turn out research. The difficulty let's put it a different way. When we wind up debunking a scientific article, it can take us 8, 9, 10 hours to really dig into it and go back into the citations and look at the narrative being presented. And it is very difficult for a member of the full-time faculty who's doing his research to put aside 8 or 10 hours every month to look at 1, 2, or 3 articles that he's getting from a journal. So that's a problem right there.
Yeah, very much misaligned incentives. And Henry gives a few specific examples. The big one is a pretty major academic publisher. They're called Hindawi. They're a subsidiary of John Wiley & Sons, which is one of the big boys in academic publishing. But apparently recently they had some 500 papers withdrawn from their various journals because they discovered, or they suspect, I don't know if it's been proven yet, but there were allegedly rings of journal editors and reviewers and even scientists who are publishing studies who are collaborating and letting fraudulent articles through the peer review process so they could pad their resumes, like Chuck was just talking about. So
exactly, and there's some misaligned incentives on the publisher's side too, which we should mention. Publishing scientific journals is a very lucrative business. The margins are are at about 20%, which is unbelievable when you consider that the margin for, say, a grocery store or a restaurant is 1%. The journals are collecting a huge amount of money, and because peer review is a resume builder, they get a lot of free labor. So they have an incentive to publish a lot of articles. They also have an incentive to create new journals, in part because science gets to be more and more specialized, but also in part because more journals means more possible income. And when you have more journals, you need more articles to fill them. And so maybe the standards for what's acceptable begin to decline. The other piece that I find interesting is that oftentimes researchers will present the same data with a slightly different narrative or viewpoint and have it published in 2 or 3 journals over the course of 3 months as different material. So that contributes to the problem. And the other piece that I think we don't think about a lot is that the costs and the labor behind doing original research, and now I'm talking about not basic science, not looking at cells, but looking at people, sociology, healthcare writ large, those kind of things. That's very expensive to do, and it takes a long time to get those studies done. So a lot of what's being published is based on surveys or meta-analysis, or it's data diving into established databases that already exist. And all of those are fraught with statistical problems. And that adds to the issue because the ugly truth of the matter is that for most papers, a statistician is brought in to do the statistics because none of the authors have a clue as to what the appropriate statistics are, let alone the peer reviewer that's going to look at it.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting to highlight that just because there's a name on a paper doesn't mean they actually know the content that they've supposedly produced. I always find that kind of amusing. So it seems to me there's a few things you could do to at least try to fix this. One would be pay peer reviewers.
Absolutely.
And pay them enough so they have an incentive to catch mistakes, because as of now, it's caught, or most of these mistakes or fraud, these cases of fraud, they're caught by data sleuths, as Henry calls them. These are just independent scientists or people who go through academic journals and they look for things that are wrong, and then they report it to a website like Retraction Watch, or they report it to a major science news outlet. And that's really the only way we would discover this stuff. So it seems you could pay peer reviewers. It seems you could publish negative results or be willing to publish more negative results. That way you have researchers who will be less inclined, I think, to, do data dredging and p-hacking and write anything to get some kind of a positive newsworthy result, because then they might do a good study and go, we didn't find anything, but here's what we did. So, don't make the same mistake, kind of a thing. What do you think about that?
Oh, I think you're absolutely correct. And it's a problem that people don't publish negative things because that information doesn't become necessarily general knowledge. And we have people repeating the same errors over and over again. And in addition, knowing that something doesn't work or doesn't happen can be useful. Not everything that's couched in a positive light is necessarily helpful. But if you look at some of these papers, and the one that we were emailing back and forth about vaping is a good example, where they found some changes, but they don't know what the changes mean. So they're trying to find some way to put it in a light that shows, gee, there's something going on here. We need to do more work.
Yeah, I could just go on for days about this. It's really, really frustrating to see what goes on, because I see that where you have these animal models where they're like, oh, there's some change at the cellular level, and maybe this product now causes cancer. Like there's those kind of leaps from really rudimentary experiments. But then, as you said, and I've seen this too, people will do a study where they feed rats grape supplement, And then they'll publish another paper based on the same experiment. And they're like, okay, but now we gave them a little bit less grape supplement. And now we've had this whole new study, right? So,
Exactly. And if you think about it, it really gets back to publish or perish, and the misalignment where the scientists have to create an increasing supply, and the manufacturers are driving a demand because it drives profits for them. Not the manufacturers, excuse me, the journals do that. And when you think about it, there's very little at this point that the journals are doing other than formatting the articles and printing them. And to be honest, I don't know the last time I opened an in-print journal. I think that everything has really moved into the digital age, and that's one of those lagging things where the libraries are continuing to support in-print journals. And it's weird because I don't know anybody that uses them anymore.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And again, many people may not know this, but these academic journals, they survive with library subscriptions. You have academic institutions that pay thousands of dollars a year to gain access to, like all of the Wiley and Sons journals, for example. And then that way the researchers and students have access to all this material. But it's not like a normal magazine where, someone pays $5 a month or $12 a month, and then they get it in their mailbox. I mean, that happens a little bit, I'm sure, but that's not where the money is. I guess all that to say, academic publishing is a really gross industry. It's like pornography, but sleazier. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. The laborers in the industry really are almost incidental. They're just bodies that do the heavy lifting, so to speak. And then there's a few people at the top that just make a boatload of cash.
Exactly.
Anyways, there was one other final thing I was going to ask you before we move on to booze and cancer. As a physician, did you ever run into a situation where you would look at something in a journal and go, well, this is obviously wrong. I can't apply this to my practice. Or does that happen at all? Or does the medical profession just disregard most of this literature?
I don't know what the medical profession does. I'm a surgeon, so unless it's an instruction manual, I'm not so sure that it necessarily pertains. I think, that gets to this other quality about journals, is that journals are an intermediate source in the time frame of looking at materials. The latest and greatest is presented at national meetings, or increasingly in the monthly newsletters that the professional societies send out to their membership, talking about, there's a study coming out, talking about what's at least germane for surgeons. That's my area where I can speak with the greatest experience and expertise about. So journals typically are 6 to 12 months for the process of submitting an article and going through peer review and getting published. Now that time frame has gotten shortened somewhat because of COVID and the use of prepress, which has changed the picture entirely. But journals tend to have information that is starting to become the consensus. So for most practitioners, it's either nodding yes or nodding no to information they already have. And then at the end of it are yearbooks and textbooks, which contain the settled science for a particular field, at least at the moment.
We'll have to talk about the preprint thing some other time, because I think that there's been a lot of criticism of it, but I think it might be a benefit in the long run, in that someone puts up a preprint of their study, and then it's not just 2 or 3 reviewers that look at it. It's everybody who has an interest in that field.
Yes.
So you will get some abuse. You'll get the media amplifying studies that aren't ready for prime time, if you will. But you'll also get other experts and other academics will look at stuff and they'll go, well, you better fix this before you try to put this in any journal because this is garbage, So I don't know. There's trade-offs in any case. I guess the lesson is always just read this stuff with a flat of salt nearby. You just have to be skeptical until you can verify that what you're reading is accurate.
Yes.
Okay, well, moving on, let's talk about, I think it's one of everyone's favorite topics, Chuck, and that, of course, is alcohol.
Drinking.
And yes, yeah, everybody likes it, although less and less I find as I get older. It's quality more than quantity.
Well, and you are in the right state for quality.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Nice cocktail after putting your son down after a long bath routine. It's
okay. We got to stop right there. I'm getting very concerned with the phrase "putting your son down." I understand it, but I think we have to find a different phrase to describe putting the child to bed.
There you go. Yes, for the non-parents or for anyone that's looking for material to cancel me, let me be clear. My son is alive and well. Oh God, after he takes a bath in the evening, which can be a stressful event, as any parent will tell you. Nice cocktail. It's a great unwind. Watch a show you've seen 18 times with a drink. It's a nice experience. In any case, though, what our colleague Dr. Josh Bloom is talking about here is the fact that many people, whether they are just consumers or they're reporters or they work in one of the advocacy groups that we attack all the time, they go on and on about minute chemical exposures. So BPA or pesticides or, whatever, insert scary chemical here. They will tell parents especially to be worried about, the chemicals in receipt paper or the chemicals in plastic containers or lead in baby food, as we've talked about recently. And there's very little evidence that these exposures are harmful because, for one thing, you have a massive federal regulatory apparatus that's charged with looking at this stuff. And so for all their faults, and they are many, they do a relatively decent job of reviewing, the safety of the food supply and the safety of chemicals that are in consumer products and so forth. And then you have groups like ACSH with the expertise to debunk a lot of the bad science out there. So all that to say, there's very little reason to worry about most of these chemicals, I should say. But then you have a lot of these same people who will take selfies at cocktail parties. And of course, they've got alcohol in their hands. And alcohol, as Chuck, you're the physician here, so you can verify this for people. Alcohol can be very, very dangerous, obviously in an acute sense, but chronically, it can cause some very, very serious diseases if you abuse it. So let's stop there. That's the premise of the article. What were your thoughts? Anything specific about this story?
Well, first of all, alcohol is only a chemical to Josh, who is a chemist. To everybody else, it's somewhere in the range of an acceptable sin to a social lubricant. And it's pitched in a different way than the chemicals that we're frightened of on a variety of reasons. First of all, it's natural. It comes from yeast, Two, it's ancient. This is not something we just invented. Perhaps Everclear is, but alcohol has been around for a long, long time. Every civilization has some form of fermented drink to have. And I think that gives it a different point of view than we get about talking about BPA or, the forever chemicals or any of the things that have been invented in the last 150, 170 years, which are not natural and haven't stood the test of time, and then you get back into that argument about nature from the Romantics of 1840. So I think that's a significant piece, especially the fact that people find it as a social lubricant. You're a little tense before going to a party. You have a drink and it kind of opens things up and people get to talk and things flow. So that's one difference. It certainly has been associated with a lot of cancers, though to be fair, there's some other entanglements there. If you look at that list that Josh put forward, with the exception of the liver and the colon, they were all head and neck tumors, tumors of the mouth, the tongue, the throat. And when you think about the person that's a heavy drinker, the image that frequently will come to mind is sitting in a dark bar, smoking cigarettes and drinking. So now you have two carcinogens that there's no question that they're both carcinogens acting at once. And I think that's part of why you see a much higher incidence of head and neck cancers in this group associated with drinking. So that's, the medical piece of it. The other piece is we don't really know what to do with it. We've already tried prohibition, and that has not worked out really well. And there was an interesting article coming out in the next week talking about the effect of prohibition on media coverage. And in this case, they were looking at media in China, and they were looking at the prohibition on the sale of ivory. And the Chinese have used a tremendous amount of ivory culturally and in their art. And what I found interesting is that when they presented the material back in 2016 there's now a worldwide prohibition on ivory, which is all to the best on behalf of the elephants. All the media articles talked about the cultural value of ivory and why it's precious and why we should continue to have it. Fast forward to 2019, and they were selling ivory that had been culled and taken by poachers, and they were now selling because there was excess ivory, and all of a sudden the articles flipped 180 degrees, and now is that why are we dealing with ivory at all? Ivory is bad. This is this whole process of taking ivory from elephants is detrimental to the ecology of the planet. Just to flip, just on the basis of whether the substance of interest, going back to alcohol, was prohibited or not. And I think you see the same thing. We've certainly seen the same thing with marijuana. There's something about the forbidden that everybody wants.
It's a fascinating aspect of human psychology. And I think it goes to an important point, which is that when it comes to these public health issues, there's a lot of other factors that influence how we think about them. It's not that Senator so-and-so sits down for a lovely evening of, non-alcoholic beer and reading through the latest issue of Science magazine, right? It's like in the political sense, there's constituents, there's money being thrown around.
Yes,
there, cultural baggage, right? So it's like we're not really having a scientific discussion here. And maybe another aspect, and Chuck, you briefly touched on this, is that people love drinking. People recognize, and correctly in my mind, that, you can have a little bit of alcohol and, don't drive, don't abuse it, and it can be enjoyed safely, So I guess the way to put it would be we should treat all of these chemicals, or at least the ones that are safely used, we should treat all of them like alcohol and recognize that, yes, in a high enough dose, in the right circumstances, they can be dangerous, but we don't use them in those contexts. We use them where they're appropriate, and life goes on.
Yes, we're back to everything in moderation, and that's oftentimes difficult. Now, there's also, it's fair to say that the disinhibiting qualities of alcohol vary from person to person, and that for some people, alcohol is not a good choice of drugs. It makes them socially not good people for, any number of reasons. So, that's usually the rap on alcohol. They don't usually talk about the health aspects of it, even though alcohol probably kills far more people than other things that we do.
True enough. So there you go. Be skeptical of what you read in the headlines, and be moderate when you consume alcohol, and you will be a little bit of a better person for that.
And now the other thing, just to throw it in, is they've asked physicians to ask about drug use as part of the annual examination, and so you get asked about alcohol. We have asking my 80-year-olds about whether they're smoking pot yet. So, but I've never told the truth if they ask me how much I drink, because I ain't telling them, and I don't think I'm alone there. I think everybody minimizes how much drinking they do, because especially when a doctor's asking, he's going to write it down. It's going to be in, as we say, in your permanent record. So that's going to have an effect down the line when we start using these electronic health records to look at the health problems associated with alcohol, because we ain't going to be getting truthful information that's in there. We'll have the information that they have, but it ain't going to be the truth.
It's a great point. And it's funny. I got a call from the state of California yesterday, just out of the blue, urging me to get a COVID booster. And they knew everything about me. I guess healthcare providers shared this kind of information with the state, which is, I guess, typical, but they knew, because I've been vaccinated. So they knew which shots I got. They knew when I got them. Mm-hmm. and then they said, well, here, let's set an appointment for you, Right. And despite my very vocal support for vaccination, it kind of pissed me off that this guy whom I didn't know knew all this information about me and was pressuring me to go do something in the middle of my workday. It just rubbed me the wrong way,
Exactly. And by the way, they also know which arm you got the injections in.
Do they really?
Yes, because they write it down. It was part of what the CDC wanted. Earlier when they were giving the injections, they wanted to know which arm. And, remember that when we had to hang around for 15 minutes?
Right.
Because that's when most of the bad reactions were going to take place.
Sure. It makes sense that they would record that. It was just strange to me, that some guy who didn't even give me his name, or maybe he did, I don't remember. Let's call him Fred. Fred had all this personal information about me, and it made me mad. And even when I told him, I was like, look, I have a healthcare provider. I have a doctor I'm on good terms with. I can go get this myself. Thank you. Now I'm going to go back to work. And he's like, oh, well, is there a reason you don't want to do it? It's like, just stop, dude. Just, so all that to say, people are jealous of their privacy and their autonomy. And so that's another important aspect of this. But all that to say, just a little bit of moderation goes a long way. Chuck, thank you as always for joining me, and
my pleasure.
Thank you to everyone who's listening. We're watching the numbers tick upwards, and it's awesome that people are seeming to get some benefit out of this podcast. So if you want to get the stories we talk about, you just go to the website, acsh.org, subscribe tab up at the top, click on that, punch in your email, and then 3 times a week, we'll send you the stories we publish. The ones you read the most are the ones we talk about. So if you read the stories and then you come here, you're going to know in advance what we're talking about. You'll be a little bit smarter. And with that, we will see everybody next week for episode 36.
Take care.